Okay, guys. I'm going to try doing it kind of the mini lectures this way via screencast. That way, you guys can kind of see some of the feedback I was getting was that there was some confusion over what slide I was on and what slide I was talking about. So we'll start with this and see how it goes. If this is easier for you guys, then we can stick with it. So what you're looking at now is a map of Greece and its overseas colonies by 550 BC. This is a map that that you should come back to later when we look at the Persians, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. So you'll notice that the Greek areas, right, not just around Greece, but also in modern day Turkey, right, pretty much everywhere where there was a coastline, the Greeks had colonies set up so that they could trade, that they had ports, that they had markets, that they could share their goods, because remember, they needed access to these trade routes because of their geographic limitations. You also notice up along the Black Sea, we talked about that when we talked about the Battle of Troy, um, that this was a highly coveted area up here, and you can see that the Greeks really took advantage of that with all of the colonies around there. So keep track of this, keep this in the back of your head when we start talking about the Persians, because it's going to seem like a quick shift, but it's important for us to keep this in the back of our minds. So next up, quick history of the Persians. This is we skipped over this in chapter 2. We're going to focus a little bit more on it now, because there's quickly coming a major war between the Greeks and the Persians. Spoiler alert, but that's what's happening. So this guy right here is a guy by the name of Cyrus. He was the first Persian emperor, and he started expanding the territory from Persia, which is in modern day Iran, to the areas outside of their kind of hometown. Eventually, he got almost all of the places we've talked about before. Mesopotamia was conquered. Anatolia, right, central Turkey, was conquered by him. And then his son, Cambyses, went into Egypt and conquered Egypt. So we're talking about an empire that got its start pretty small, and in a few short years, conquered pretty much all of the civilizations that we've talked about so far. You've got all of Mesopotamia, you've got all of Anatolia, and you've got Egypt. So outside of India and China, that they pretty much had everything. So let's talk about how they were able to maintain that control, expand that control, and basically start to threaten the Greeks. So one of the things that the Persians were known for was how they organized their empire. They didn't try to rule it all as one ruler over this very, very, very large amount of land. They knew that empires, by their very nature, are diverse. So they needed to have systems in place that allowed for different people in different regions to have their own kind of government, their own say. So they set up what are called satraps, which is basically a province. So the whole Persian Empire had 20 provinces. So think of that like states in the United States. And a satrap was the governor. So these were called satrapies, was the Persian word for a province. And a satrap was basically the ruler in each province, who was connected back to the emperor and who had a say in how things were governed. So the emperor would tell the satraps would then enforce the laws in their region. But unlike other areas, other empires that kind of forced their way and their beliefs onto other people's, the Persians were known as being pretty tolerant. They were not forcing people to convert to their religion, which was actually a form of monotheism called Zoroastrianism. They were not forcing people to change their lifestyles. All they basically said was, if you pay your taxes, you'll be fine, and they'll let you do whatever you want. They were pretty famous for letting whatever civilizations they conquered maintain their own identities, culture, heritage, history. All they asked for was just a little bit of tax money, which, if you remember from the 300 video that you watched yesterday, the Persian messenger, before he got kicked into the hole, basically said that all he asked for is, bread and water, or essentially taxes, tribute, so that they could support the Persian army. That there was really no other restrictions on how the the Greeks would have to live their lives. It's going to be important um, later when we talk about the wars themselves and how and how the we have perceived the results of the Persian Wars through a process of what we call historiography, who writes the history. But that's a lot. We'll get into that later, but just kind of again keep that in the back of your mind too. Um, the Persians also had a huge bureaucracy of people who were going around to the different areas, collecting taxes, keeping track of the records, um, so that they could basically maintain their control over this very, very, very large area. Um, and probably the most important thing that they did, which other empires will soon follow, their model is creating roads, specifically very long roads that lead back to the capital. Um, I mean, if you think about it, in a time before even cars and trains, 1,700 miles traveled in a week is pretty remarkable, and it would have been, like basically the ancient version of texting. That information could have been traveled around so fast, so quickly that it really put them a step ahead of everyone else in the region, that any of their other rivals, those kinds of things. Um, so let's talk about what that royal road looked like and how that had an impact in the empire. So here's a map of the Persian Empire as it expanded. I'm going to highlight a couple things here. First, notice that the Persian Empire in 557 was this little area right here, which is on the big map would be, right around Persepolis, which is where Persian got its name, Persepolis. Notice the Polis part of that. As it expanded, you see that by 539 BC, you had this much larger area that the Persians had. That's like 20 years later, they expanded all of that, and then 40 years after that, by 550 BC, you see they have all of Egypt, they have all of Turkey, they have all of these regions over here, and they're even starting to threaten Greece. So that's where it matters for our purposes for the next day or so, is how the Persians threatened Greece, how the Persians started. The Greeks were kind of freaking out over this extremely, extremely large empire who was basically knocking on their door, considering that the Greeks were small city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth. We talked before about the disadvantage of being so small was if there was a larger army coming in to conquer, that would be a major hurdle to overcome. And you can imagine what they were thinking at the time. So I'll stop here and just kind of let you guys think about how that would work. And when next video, we'll have information around the Greek soldiers and how they would fight their battles. So thanks.